Welcome to the superbdiamondrange show. This is episode 31 and today's date's the 17th of January 2016. Today I'm going to be speaking about operating systems, Windows versus Mac versus Linux. Now this podcast is going to be a brief overlook of all the different operating systems out there currently, and it's not going to be very in-depth. It's just going to go over things briefly, just to give you an idea of the pros and cons of each operating system. I'll start with the most popular, well, almost the most popular. It usually is the most popular, Windows. The pros of Windows are that it's compatible with most software, so there's always a good chance that you can find software that you need that's going to be made for Windows. It's very popular, obviously. A lot of people would have probably grown up using Windows systems at home or at work. I mean, I can remember the Windows 98 days, the XP days, the Vista, as bad as they were, up to Windows 7. Completely avoided number 8, and I was kind of glad to do that. And currently I have got machine running Windows 10, and it is big improvement on 8 and 8.1, and it's actually more like 7, which is great. One of the beauties of Windows, I believe, is it's great for gaming. If you're really into games, you can build a really strong gaming PC and get really good graphics cards and sound cards, and you can really have great fun with games. And it's always been good for games, and you've always been able to find most games available on the Windows platform. And I've always preferred playing games on PC versus console. I've always felt that it's a lot better to play, and I quite like Steam. I like the idea that you can download a lot of your favourite games that are quite reasonably priced, particularly when they have sales. And you can sort of keep the games in your video library, so it's really good, and you can access the games on different systems just by logging in and just reinstalling the games again. So, and also it saves you collecting games and having boxes and discs, so it's quite a good way to buy games and keep games permanently without sort of collecting a lot of different boxes and so on, like sort of we used to in the old days. Because I had quite a few games that unfortunately didn't work on Windows 10, and it was something to do with a security issue, and the answer for me was to just download Steam, and the same games that I had were quite reasonably priced on there, so I ended up just selling the games on eBay and just downloading them on Steam for quite reasonable prices, and they work fine now. I find with Windows that if it's tweaked and maintained well, it can run really good. It's very important, obviously, to make sure that you have the right kinds of security and maintenance programs installed, because out of all the operating systems, it being the most popular, there's always a good chance of potentially getting a virus at some point. If you're unlucky, or if you just it can happen, kind of thing. It's not great when it does, and can cause a lot of problems. So yeah, you've got to be really up on your security, and obviously regularly maintain it, doing things like defrag, maybe using programs like CCleaner to kind of keep on top of things. What I find with Windows is that it does get slow after a while, so I usually find myself reformatting every so often, especially if it just starts to get really, really slow and sluggish. And what I really don't like is the annoying updates that you don't manually do yourself, but obviously you might be doing a shutdown or a restart, and it will just decide that it wants to do these updates, and depending on your internet connection, they can take quite some time. And even sometimes booting into Windows after it not you having it for a long time, when it starts to get slow and sluggish, can be really time consuming, and you'd almost be quicker drinking a cup of coffee and coming back to the computer by the time it switches on. So yeah, the updates really do annoy me. Yeah, so I'd say you're definitely much more likely to get a virus than any other operating system, and it's purely down to, I would say, the fact that there's much more Windows users out there, and that you're more likely to be targeted, and if you haven't got the right security in place, that can sort of take place. But I mean, ultimately, if it's tweaked and maintained well, it can be really good. And it's obviously a very familiar operating system. A lot of people will know how to use it intuitively. Even the more recent ones, barring number 8, they kind of keep the same concept, so it's quite easy to navigate around, and it hasn't got more complicated, or they haven't drastically changed it so much that it's you wouldn't be able to pick it up. I mean, I would say I'm most familiar with Windows XP, purely because I probably had that operating system the longest in my life of any operating system. And I'm going to talk about Linux later, but there were times back in the day when I tried Linux, and I wasn't really ready to try it, and I would quickly run back to Windows where it was familiar and I knew how to do it and what I was doing. But I can maybe talk about that later on. I'm going to move on to Mac. Some of the pros of Mac is, I believe, that it's very simple. It's good for beginners. It's quite easy. It's very user friendly. You could teach somebody how to use it quite fast. It's perfect for media. I mean, if you're a movie editor, if you like doing, Photoshop, if you like music, doing sort of music editing, it's one of the best for that by far. And the way a lot of the machines are built, they use really good hardware that's really good quality, good sound cards, and obviously the Macs are really well built. They are, in a way, the Mercedes of the computing world, and that's reflected a lot in the price, because you do pay a lot of money for the spec that you get, and in many cases you could build a PC a lot cheaper and put Windows and Linux on it, than what you would pay for a Mac, and you'd probably get a strong system. But some people just like the Macs because they're, again, the operating system's quite easy to use. It is compatible with a lot of big programs. So from that point of view, it's quite good. I mean, ultimately, I think it just simply works, and a lot of people, I used to refer to it as a club, but I feel that Apple, if you get on Apple and you buy a few apps, so in other words, you pay for a few apps, and they turn out to be really good. So in my case, I bought Final Cut Pro, I've bought a few other sort of apps here and there, and they're really good apps and they work really well. And I've tried other apps that were free that were probably not as good, and I've kind of felt that for me, you start to feel like connected with Apple and the software that you bought with it, so you kind of feel like you need it in your life, and it's always going to be there for you and it'll always work. So from that point of view, I can understand why a lot of people, when they maybe try Mac over Windows, they become converts, and they might want to stay in the Apple club. And but what I find really hard about Apple is that if anything ever happens to your system and you haven't got the money to buy a new one, it's always difficult, because you want to keep using it, but if you haven't got a contingency plan to get yourself another system soon. And this also goes for phones. There'll be people with for example, iPhone 5 or iPhone 4, and they'll hang on to those phones as long as possible, even if they don't work, just purely because they're going to want to buy another iPhone that they can't necessarily afford, or they don't have the savings for in the background, because obviously they are expensive phones. I mean, you can pick them up for 600 quid, 400 to 600, and and upwards, depending on the particular model and version. but ultimately it makes people think, oh, I'm not ready to buy the upgrade yet, but my phone is okay. I don't really want to buy something else like an Android that's probably half the price, or something simple, because they get used to the iPhone and they think that it's the best phone and it's simple, and they just want to keep buying the iPhone. So therefore every time there's a new one, they feel that they can't try anything else out, that they can't replace it, that they've got to keep buying that one. So it kind of brings you into a brand loyalty, so to speak, of Apple. And I believe I'm not completely convinced or bought over by them, but I will admit there are programs that simply do work and are easy. And I've never had any problem with Mac. Well, I say I've never had a problem. I've never had a problem with the operating system or anything like that, or using them. But I have had problems. I mean, my introduction to the world of Apple was basically the first ever Apple machine I bought was an iMac, and I bought it online, I believe, and I got it upgraded. You could customize it whenever you bought it online, and I upgraded the RAM from 4 gig to 8 gig, and the machine, when I took it home, it was, I was pretty fascinated by it at the beginning. I liked the build quality of the keyboard, the big screen of the iMac. It was all in one, I suppose, and you had your Bluetooth mouse and your keyboard, and it just all looked very simple and well put together. And unfortunately, I had some problems with it in terms of it was an issue that was inherent in that system from more or less when I bought it. So within the first 2 weeks of having it, but it used to make a really loud crashing sound that would loop, and no one really knew what it was. And we had different theories. It could be that I was using the Firefox browser and not the Safari browser, and then they thought it was a Flash player issue. But the sound was so bad that when it happened, we used to have to force shut down the computer just to stop the sound, because obviously the whole thing would freeze and you couldn't use the keyboard or mouse. And this happened all the time. And obviously when it did happen, we lived in a flat at the time, and it was so loud that it was just like you had to switch it off straight away just to to kind of turn the sound off, because it was so loud and deafening even. And it culminated in a lot of back and forth with Apple communication with people over in Ireland at the time that were dealing with it. And I had to bring the iMac. I didn't have a car at the time, so I used to have to bring it in a big box on the bus into Brent Cross Apple Store, and I used to lug it there. And 3 times I brought it in. Each time they said that they looked at it and it had been fixed, and a few times they put it on tests where they would leave it on for hours and hours to try to recreate what was happening at home. And sometimes I think they were able to do it, and sometimes they weren't. But eventually, by the 3rd time of going in, I'd kind of just had enough with it all, and they just gave me a new machine. So they replaced it, and then after that I had no problems ever again. I've still got the machine now, the new one they gave me after that. But it was quite disappointing. I mean, it was like my entry to the Apple world, and I had just a bit unlucky, I guess. It can happen with any electrical product where it can just have a problem inherent from the beginning, and no one really knows why it happens or understands it. But it's just one of those things. But it didn't, completely make me think badly of them. But it did, I guess it was just one of those things that the first time you try out a company and that happens, it does make you a bit doubtful of how how reliable they are. But most other people that I spoke to prior to that were giving me good feedback and saying it's amazing and it's much better than anything they used before, and they swear that they would never go back to the other operating systems. It's other thing that I wanted to just mention is that I feel that many people might disagree with me, but I would say that it's not the easiest to upgrade a lot of Mac systems, and a lot of people would probably end up having to go to the Apple Store or authorized sort of repair agent of Apple that, could sort of do upgrades for them, whereas a PC would be a lot easier to self upgrade. Obviously things can go wrong with it, and there is, like I said earlier, the brand loyalty is a major thing. To me, Apple is almost a religion, because you'll get people queuing up, or putting a tent outside the shop, in waiting for the new iPhone, and then when they get it home, the phone drops out of the box straight on the floor. And then obviously the iPhones are just, people are just crazy over them. But overall, I do think Mac is very good, and again, it just depends if you're willing to pay the price. But for the price you pay, I would say it is very, very good most of the time, and it would be ideal for a lot of people that just want something simple that just simply works. I'm going to move on to my personal favourite that I'm really, really big fan of, and I must say that, I mentioned about troubles I had with the Apple machine when I had to bring it to the store 3 times, and I've had troubles with this operating system as well, in that I found it way too advanced for me. Always wanted to switch over to it for some reason unknown, because I always thought it was quite interesting. But anyway, I'm talking about Linux at the moment, and to me, there was a few times in my life I spent some time in Italy, and I remember seeing posters of Linux and different operating systems that were available, and with the penguin tux, was always on these posters, and I was always curious, what is this thing called Linux? What is it all about? And I noticed that when I was back in London, I couldn't really see much about it. I never really, I thought it was an operating system that was used in other countries, but it wasn't very popular, in my homeland. It was just something that I saw when I was going abroad, so I didn't really know too much about it. And I remember purchasing Linux, because you can obviously get a lot of free operating systems online, but I think the first time I actually purchased it, and I bought it online and got a disc sent to me in a manual, and I think it was Mandriva. I believe that was the first one I ever bought, and it had additional software that came with the disc because I paid for it. And I just put it on. I wiped out Windows, put it on, and I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I didn't know how it worked, what to do. It was very, very confusing. And back then there wasn't a lot of forums like there are now, in that if you had a friend that knew Linux, you'd be alright. But if you didn't know anybody, and you didn't, the internet wasn't quite like it is now, in terms of, you can find people that are into the same things you're into, and forums. So it was literally a lot of guesswork, and I'll be honest with you, even simple things like connecting my wireless to the Linux system, or getting the internet working, was really difficult. And it wasn't like a Windows machine where you could go and get the driver. You had to do various complicated tasks, or maybe terminal commands, just to get a driver for the internet to work. So that alone was like a stumbling block, and I couldn't really move forward. And again, I rushed back to Windows, and even that was a nightmare, because I'd installed what was known as the Grub bootloader, and I had to change some settings, but it almost meant that I couldn't reinstall Windows straightforward. So when I put the disk in, it wouldn't recognize it, and various things. So I was kind of, at that point, I was like, I'm really getting frustrated with this. I'm going to give up, and I kind of pretty much did give up. And when I went back to Windows, I was unhappy in Windows before, and then I went back to Windows and I was happy again. But then as the years passed, I got unhappy with Windows again. I was like, I want to try Linux again. By this point, Linux was changing. It was becoming a lot more user-friendly. They brought out Ubuntu, which was really, really good, was really, a lot more user-friendly. Even for people from Windows that were converting, it was a much easier transition. And again, I'd ordered a disk of Ubuntu. I think it was free, but they posted it out to me this time. And again, I gave it another try. And by that point, I was realizing that I was using a lot of open source programs that a lot of them were default. within Linux, like things like Firefox. I was using Firefox on Windows, and obviously that was the default browser on Linux. So in terms of migrating from Windows, nowadays, depending on the distro, the version of Linux, it is a lot easier and more straightforward, and you've got a lot more support. You've got a lot of forums. So you've got things like the Ubuntu forum or the Linux Mint forum, and so on. So it's a lot more easier to change to Linux now than it was before. And I've heard people, like friends, comment that they feel that the Linux operating system feels incomplete, and in a way they're always updating them, and you've got different versions. So you might have Linux 17.1, then you might have, like, say, 18 version, stuff like that. So it kind of is incomplete in that they keep making new versions, but each version is much better, and it's no different to Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10. They're just going about it their own way, and ultimately, if you can find a long-term support operating system, you can get between 1, 2, and 3 years of support. So if you feel comfortable with that operating system and it works for you, then and it's stable, then it's good to stick to that, because that's what I like to do. If I find one that I like, I normally stick to it. But I do get curious about the other distros and flavors of Linux, just to give them a try. And I occasionally I do run them on a virtual machine just to see what they're like. And and also I like to watch YouTube videos about people giving reviews of new operating systems by Linux, just to kind of see what they think. Obviously there's lots of distributions of Linux. You've got like the likes of Red Hat, which I believe you can buy sort of paid versions of Linux. It's quite popular, and you get certain support from them that, again, it might be paid for, but not always. There is free versions, and you've got the likes of Mandriva. You've obviously got Ubuntu, you've got Linux Mint. Obviously one of the things I found with Linux is that if you start to learn the terminal commands, they're a lot quicker, and again, it is quite advanced, because it is, sometimes you could type some commands and you don't really understand what you're doing, and unless you're really experienced or you understand how they work. But obviously Linux is more advanced than the other two operating systems I mentioned, in that it is the Meccano of operating systems. I would probably describe Mac as more like Lego, but Linux is more like Meccano. And I love the fact that you install applications on there, and when you do a sort of system update or software update, it usually updates all the software at one time. Whereas in Windows, you've actually got to go and manually update each piece of software yourself, sort of one by one almost. Whereas this just does them all at the same time, every so often when you choose to update, which I think is quite handy, because it just means that, you have less to worry about, because you haven't got to go from one app to the next or software to the next, trying to update them individually. So it's really, really good. Obviously the chances of getting a virus are really low, probably the lowest of all the operating systems. So I don't really bother too much with security for Linux, but I'm sure there are people that do, and that might have firewalls, and I know there will be cases of people probably having had a virus in Linux, but it doesn't seem very popular or very happen very often. So I kind of feel a lot more safe in the Linux environment. It's very customizable as well, so you can change the look of it and the style of it, and you get the different environments like KDE, I believe, and GNOME, and you get sort of lightweight versions of Linux like XFCE, which are really lightweight, and I think the KDE one is really like Flash looking, really looks really impressive when you run it. It's very beautiful sort of looking. You get the really great free open source software, which I know is sometimes available also on the likes of Windows and Apple iOS, but ultimately things like Audacity, which I know is on many platforms, but it's that sort of, just to give you an idea of free open source software, that is an amazing piece of audio editing program, kit. So, and I mean, there's it is like the Yoda of audio editing, as a good friend once said. And to me, it's amazing. And again, people could pay a lot of money to get a program like that, but it's been available free for a long time now, and it's updating all the time and getting better and better. So I really appreciate those kind of programs. Obviously most Linuxes are free to download, and you don't really pay anything. So it's not like Apple where you have to pay for everything. I mean, I know that Apple do free operating systems, but you paid a lot of money up front for the system itself, so it's really not as good as what Linux does, I think, in terms of. And obviously you get great long-term support. Ultimately, it's not always the most user-friendly. Again, if you were migrating from Windows, I would be looking at the likes of dual booting so that you could play about with it, learn it. If you feel confident and master it, then you could make the plunge completely. A lot of things that hold people back from coming over to Linux full time is they might find software that isn't available in Linux but is available in Windows. Like, I have a friend at the moment that uses a Windows movie editing program that is, he says it works really well when he makes short films, and he's not found one on Linux that compares and processes his movies as well and makes them look as good. So he's sort of stuck using Windows, but he's dipping in and out of Linux. He's using a pen drive to kind of flip in and out of it, and then you've got the option of like the virtual box and things like that, so you can install the likes of that within Windows and other operating systems just to try out Linux and learn it and get to know it. But the community is really good in Linux. The forums are amazing. The people are really friendly, and any problem I've ever had, if I've asked questions about it, 9 times out of 10 it gets solved, or there'll be a previous thread that solved it. So I've got to give a shout out to the Linux community, because they are absolutely fantastic. So yeah, that's another reason why I'm a really big fan. So I would say, to finish up, overall my vote goes to Linux. Just always liked it. I admit it's not the easiest, and I'm still no master of it, but I can get it to do what I need it to do, and that I'm content with that. I'd probably rank or rate Mac second. Again, it is a more expensive option, but the operating system is very simple and user friendly, and the software is really good on it. Unfortunately, I'm going to put Windows last. I don't use Windows as much as I used to. I must say that playing games on Windows is great though, especially online games like Street Fighter, Ultra 4, games like that. Even Final Fantasy 7 are really good. So from a gaming point of view, I really like Windows, and again, there are certain software that runs really good on Windows and is available on Windows. So I don't think it's that bad. And I think Windows 10 has been really good for Microsoft as well, in terms of returning to form almost. So I am a big fan of Windows 10, but just probably wouldn't use it as much as I would the likes of Linux or Mac. So yeah, that's basically my opinion. It wasn't the most detailed or in-depth look at each operating system. Potentially in the future I will try to go into more detail, and I'm sorry to any listeners if I gave any bad information against their favourite operating system, but it's just an opinion. It's just my own personal journey and experience in the computing world. But yeah, once again, thank you for listening to the Superb Diamond Range podcast. If anybody would like to email me to mention anything about this episode or previous ones, they can reach me at superbdiamondrange@gmail.com. I'm also available on Twitter, so you can reach me there at SDRpod. I've also got a website, which is www.sdrpod.com. And if anybody's looking, if anyone appreciates the work I'm doing and would like to support the podcast, I'd be really grateful if you could check out the Superb Diamond Range application, which is available on the Apple Store and on Google Play. And it's a really good app that you can download onto your portable device, your phone or whatever. And the plan is down the line is to add extra audio and hopefully put some video pods on there, or video casts as well, so you would get access to that as well. So yeah, definitely take a look at the app, and I'd be really appreciative. But ultimately, hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll catch you again very soon.